So continuing the discussion of how the different colonies were founded in terms of New York and New Jersey, the last Dutch governor of the region was a dude named Peter in New York, what would be modern day New York. After the British conquered the Dutch lands in America, then the English King Charles II gave the charter, the title to actually have the lands between New England and Maryland to his brother James, who was Duke of York. But James was adamantly opposed to representative assemblies. He preferred to be able to pick who he wanted and those types of things. Residents continued to call for self-government until James finally gave in, but he did break his promise when he became the King of England after Charles II. The region that would become the other state, so New Jersey, was ruled as a separate proprietary colony, and it eventually became a royal colony. The Quakers are the ones who primarily are based in Pennsylvania. They believed human religious institutions were largely unnecessary. Just ignore all those typos. They basically thought that your relationship with the higher being was what was most important, your one-on-one relationship. They thought they could receive revelation directly from God. They didn't think they needed the Bible. It's not that they thought the Bible was bad. They just didn't see it as necessary. They cared more about your one-on-one experiences. They were also pacifists. I mean, obviously to this day they are pacifists. And they declined to show customary deference to their alleged social superiors, which basically just means that they didn't really have much social classes. Their aggressiveness in denouncing established institutions brought them trouble in both Britain and America. They were seen as heretics, and again, they went against the mainstream. They opposed slavery, which is obviously also not extraordinarily popular at the time, and they favored the Native Americans being treated decently. Elements of this culture would play a role in shaping the characterizations of U.S. that valued independence and social equality. But one of their leaders was a dude named William Penn, and he is going to basically guide a group of the Quakers to what would today become Pennsylvania as a refuge for these religious minorities. He advertised his colony widely in Europe and offered generous terms on land. So if you came over, you got a lot of acreage. And he guaranteed a representative assembly and full religious freedom. The settlers flocked to Pennsylvania from all over Europe, thinking that this was a great idea. However, once they got here, many of them didn't adhere to the Quaker teachings and eventually are going to separate. In terms of slavery, since the Quakers were opposed to it, as early as the 1600s, at first the black slaves were only a small percentage of the population, so they began with basically the same level of rights as indentured servants. But again, as Eli Whitney and the advent of the cotton gin and all that in the next century make the cotton into a cash crop, the demand is going to increase for slaves. This is going to result in increased importation and population of blacks, particularly in the southern colonies, where the king cotton was the most predominant. The slaves were often called chattel, which is a fancy way of saying property, and they came to be seen as lifelong property, whose status would be inherited by their owners as children. So once you were a slave, it was very, very difficult to escape that institution. This is directly as opposed to the rules of the Enlightenment. John Locke was one of the major English political philosophers of the Enlightenment. He and Hobbes would be the other one. Hobbes is the more pessimistic one. And then Isaac Newton is going to be another one. Newton basically had theorized that there was a natural law in the realm of science. Basically, he and other scientists were trying to discover the universal laws that governed everything. So like, why do things always fall down? Oh, because of gravity. Locke is going to try to do the same thing and look for the universal laws that govern society. Prior to him, there existed a theory of social contract in which people would accept certain restrictions on themselves for the benefit of their society, and these restrictions would be upheld by a sovereign power. So the idea was, you choose to live here, which means you choose to give up some of your rights in order to be governed correctly, quote unquote. Locke's assertion of natural law changed this perspective. He believed that if life, liberty, and property were not protected, governments could be overthrown. So the role of a government is to protect people's life, liberty, and property, and eventually we're going to make a pursuit of happiness. His ideas became the indirect theory of American political activity for leaders like Ben Franklin and obviously Thomas Jefferson. Triangular trade was a result of mercantilism. Remember that trade institution. And basically this was the idea that European merchants would buy African slaves, with goods manufactured in Europe or imported from Asian colonies. These merchants then sold the slaves in the Caribbean for commodities like sugar, cotton, and tobacco, and then those commodities were later sold in Europe and North America. This trade thrived because each partner would get the resource it wanted by exchanging resources that it had plentiful available. The Navigation Acts were the main one was in 1650 to 1651, but there were a series of these. These were British past Parliament rules that governed how trade was going to work in Britain, all in an effort to maintain Britain's superiority over mainland Europe. It dictated that certain goods shipped from a New World port were to go only to a British port or to other New World ports. So you couldn't trade with France, for example. You had to go straight to Britain and then on to France, so you had two sets of taxes, so you, as an American trader, would actually get less income. This was kind of like a detriment way to deter the people who traded into trading with other countries. It served as the foundation for England's worldwide commercial system, and it came out of the economic philosophy of mercantilism. Though it was meant to benefit the whole British Empire, its provisions helped some New World colonies at the expense of others. It was intended as a weapon in England's ongoing struggle against its rival Holland, as well as its longtime enemy of France. It led to increased tensions between Britain and the colonies. Some of the long-term effects of the Navigation Act was that it boosted the prosperity of New Englanders who engaged in large-scale shipbuilding, whereas the South, they did not do as much of the actual international trade. It hurt the residents of the Chesapeake by driving down the price of tobacco, and it transferred wealth from America to Britain by increasing the prices Americans had to pay for British goods and lowering the prices Americans received for goods they produced. Mercantilism also helped bring on a series of war between England and Holland in the late 1600s, which ultimately would result in the Spanish Netherlands and Dutch Netherlands becoming one full country. But that's world history. One of the earliest rebellions in America with the colonists was Bacon's Rebellion. This was Virginia's royal governor, William Berkeley, received strict instructions to run the colony for the benefit of Britain. Again, Britain was very, very active in terms of New World economics, wishing to maintain the upper hand. Nathaniel Bacon was a leader of a colonial frontiersmen in Virginia, and he objected to the rights granted to Virginia's wealthy inner circle, and he was angered by Berkeley's inability to protect Virginia from the attacks by the Native Americans. So he's going to lead a series of raids on the tribes of the Native Americans that were in the area, and this is going to make him very, very popular. However, Berkeley is going to have him arrested, which is going to make him a bit of a martyr. Soon after, Bacon gathered his forces. He opposed the royal governor, and he set fire to Jamestown to defend the forces' position. Berkeley ended the rebellion with the aid of British military forces. After Bacon's rebellion, American colonists turned increasingly away from indentured servitude and towards slave labor. So kind of a bit of all over the place in terms of what it did. I would most know it as dude named Bacon in Virginia, mad at Native Americans and mad at British manipulation, rebel. New Hampshire, this was, modern-day New Hampshire was originally a royal colony created by King Charles II, and remained economically dependent on Massachusetts, and Britain could continue to appoint a single person to rule both colonies until 1741. Weeks before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, New Hampshire is going to create a temporary constitution for itself, declaring itself independent from Britain. The Dominion of New England was the name for the administrative body created by King James II. Remember, he came after Charles. If you're having difficulty keeping the British monarchs straight, by the way, don't worry about it too much. For our purposes, it's Elizabeth, James I, Charles I, then it's Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, Charles II, James II. So Elizabeth, James, Charles, Charles, James. So anyways, the Dominion of New England was an administrative body created by King James II that oversaw British colonies in the New England region. It was put in place to implement the Navigation Acts to make sure that the ships that were built in New England weren't going to other ports elsewhere, and to assist the colonies in defending themselves against the continued attacks by the French and Native American forces. By this time, Native Americans had started to team up with the French, who had an amicable relationship with the Native Americans. The French actually relied extensively on the Native Americans for their fur trade because the Native Americans knew the land better. The governor-in-chief of the Dominion of New England was a guy by the name of Edmund Andros, and he outlawed town meetings, disputed titles to certain colonial lands, and proselytized on behalf of the Church of England. That basically means that he tried to convert people to the Church of England. New England colonists had originally been in favor of some sort of voluntary association, but the Dominion was very, very unpopular because of Andros's actions, and eventually colonists are going to turn away from this organization. The Halfway Covenant was a decision by Puritan colony churches to allow the grandchildren of those who did not have the personal experience of conversion to participate in select church affairs. Previously, only the children of those who had experienced conversion could participate. And this is going to reflect the decline of zealous piety among New Englanders. So it's basically opening up the church to more people with fewer restrictions in terms of the procedures they had to go through in order to be a member of the church. So you can see a general decrease in terms of the severity or the strength, whichever you want to look at it, of the religious pull in the country. That being said, by today's standards, they were still extraordinarily pious. One example of this would be the Salem witch trials. Several young girls in Salem, which is in Massachusetts, claimed to be tormented by the occult activities of certain neighbors. And they all started blaming each other, like, oh, you're a witch, you're a witch, you're a witch, you're a witch. And there was no real way to prove that you weren't a witch, so 20-some-odd people were executed. The Puritan ministers finally intervened to stop the execution, saying things were going crazy and there wasn't proof and evidence. There were different theories about the reasons that the trials occurred. Everything between political and class divisions in Salem, economic stresses from providing for growing families, the gender-biased view that women were more likely to follow evil. I mean, the whole thing started with a servant woman by the name of Tituba, who had claimed to be from voodoo descendants, had taught it to some of the girls in the area, had taught voodoo to some of the girls in the area. The writer Arthur Miller, who was married to Marilyn Monroe in the 1950s, is going to write The Crucible in 1953, which was a retelling of the Salem witch trials, but again, we've mentioned it's an allegory for the Joseph McCarthy Red Scare, quote, witch trials, quote, that were going on at the time. For those of you who are going into, I think, AP English, you will be reading The Crucible next year. It's actually not a bad read. Give it a chance. There is a horrible movie rendition. Don't rely on that. The Enlightenment is the time period that connects to the idea of deism, where the universe is created by God and then abandoned. Basically, everything is based on reason, whether it's religion, science, politics, everything is based on reason. No supernatural controls could be exerted, and all things were explainable by reason. The philosophy of the time dictates that human reason was adequate to solve mankind's problems, and correspondingly much less faith was needed in the central role of a God as an active force in the universe. There's the idea that God was basically not a non-entity, just not as important, that humans with their own minds and ability were more important. It started in Europe, probably most likely in France, and eventually is going to move over to the New World and would go on to influence culture, intellectualism, and society. Some of the important writers of this time included Isaac Newton, John Locke, and René Descartes, which I would say much more Frenchy if I didn't have this cold.